Let's dive straight into the entire history of medieval Spain, Visigothic Spain, before the Moorish storm. Picture this. It's the late 6th and early 7th centuries, and the land we now call Spain doesn't look anything like the Spain we imagine today. Forget flamenco, tapas, or castles on the horizon. The Iberian Peninsula was ruled by the Visigoths, a Germanic people who had wandered west after Rome's fall. They weren't just passing through. They built a kingdom fragile but theirs. And this world would soon face a storm no one could have predicted. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. For now, let's step into their world. The Visigoths settled in Hispania after centuries of turmoil. Picture the ruins of Roman cities, aqueducts, villas, and roads patched up and reused by these new rulers. Their kings tried to pose as Rome's heirs, though their roots were warrior rather than imperial. Their capital was Toledo, perched above the Teus River, where rulers like Leo Vigild and Reed held power. Religion was a central struggle. The Visigoths followed Arian Christianity, clashing with the Catholic faith of most locals. Tensions simmered. A ruling elite with its own language and beliefs facing a Catholic majority. In the late 6th century, King Ricard converted to Catholicism, giving the kingdom a shot at unity. It didn't solve everything, but it was a turning point. Politics, however, was brutal. Kings rose and fell at dizzying speed. Assassinations and betrayals were constant. By the early 8th century, rival nobles tore the realm apart, and while they fought, a storm gathered across the sea in North Africa. Culturally, Visigothic Spain left treasures, golden crowns, jeweled brooches, and the Liberorum, a sweeping law code, blending Roman and Gothic practice. Yet peasants lived much as before, working fields, paying dues, struggling to survive. We glimpse their churches, stone buildings with horseshoe arches that foreshadow Moorish designs. Councils in Toledo debated theology and politics, shaping kingship itself. But the kingdom remained fragile. On top of political weakness came famine, plague, and discontent. Some nobles excluded from power turned bitter. When the Moors arrived in 711, betrayal may have opened doors. Looking back, collapse seems inevitable, but no one then foresaw it. For more than 2 centuries, the Visigoths ruled, issued laws, and fused with the Roman Iberian world. They were no longer outsiders. Yet the storm was coming, led by Tariq ibn Ziyad, who would change the story forever. For now, remember Visigothic Spain as a land in transition, Roman ruins occupied by Germanic rulers, fragile unity through religion, glittering crowns on shaky foundations, the calm before the storm, the shock of 711, Tariq ibn Ziyad's invasion. Imagine the southern coast of Spain in the early 8th century. The sea is calm, villages quiet when sails rise on the horizon. Strange ships approach carrying warriors with unfamiliar banners, weapons, and faith. That morning in the year 711 would shatter an entire kingdom. Tariq ibn Ziyad's arrival wasn't just a raid. It was the beginning of a storm that would change Iberia forever. Spain then was ruled by the Visigoths, heirs to Rome, but weakened by rivalries. Kings rose and fell, nobles betrayed each other, and loyalty was fragile. So when foreign sails appeared, Spain was already fractured, and fractures are where history presses hardest. Tariq landed with about 7,000 men, mostly Berbers from North Africa. They weren't vast armies, but hardened fighters led by a bold commander. Legend says he ordered the ships burned, leaving no option but to advance or perish. Whether true or not, the story captures the spirit of that moment. No way home. except through conquest. King Roderick rushed south to confront them. His crown was contested, his nobles divided. Still, he raised a large army to crush the invaders. The two forces met at Guadalete. For the Visigoths, it was a fight for survival. For Tar's men, it was destiny. The battle was decisive. Betrayal split the Visigothic ranks. Roderick was said to have drowned, fleeing across a river, his army collapsing with him. Within days, the kingdom unraveled. Cities opened their gates, some resisting briefly, most surrendering in fear. For villagers, it must have felt like the world-ending priests whispering in stone churches, rumors spreading faster than fire in dry grass. Tariq pressed inland, seizing Cordoba, Toledo, and beyond. What began as a small invasion now looked like the foundation of a new world. Out of this shock came Al-Andalus, a Muslim-ruled Spain that would shine in learning and architecture. At the same time, resistance stirred. In the northern mountains, tiny enclaves like Aureus survived, sparking the legend of Covadonga and the first seeds of the reconquista. Looking back, the invasion feels sudden yet inevitable. Sudden because a kingdom fell in a single season. Inevitable because the Visigoths were already divided. Tariq struck at the moment the cracks were widest. Centuries later, chroniclers remembered him as the commander who burned his ships, toppled a kingdom, and inspired his men with fiery words. Whether every detail is true hardly matters. What endures is the shock the day Spain's old order fell and a new chapter began. The fall of the Visigothic kingdom at Guadalete. Picture this. The early 8th century, long before Spain looked anything like today. Imagine a summer battlefield near a river called Guadalete in the south of Iberia. The air is heavy with dust and the pounding of hooves. On one side, the Visigothic kingdom, an old power that had ruled for centuries. On the other, a force just crossed from North Africa, led by commanders Iberia had never heard of. That clash would erase a kingdom in days. The Visigoths had ruled since Rome's fall. For 3 centuries, they adapted Roman laws and built palaces in Toledo. But by the early 700s, the kingdom was unstable. Kings were chosen by nobles and rivals often killed to claim the throne. Few kings died peacefully, so when Roderick took power, half the nobility rejected him. That weakness set the stage for disaster. Then came the Moors. Tariq ibn Ziyad, a Berber general under the Umayyads, led a small army across the strait in 711. Legend says he burned his ships, declaring victory or death. True or not, it captured the determination of his men. They weren't here to raid. They came to stay. At Guadalete, Roderick faced them with a vast army. His numbers were huge, but loyalty was thin. Some nobles hated him enough to abandon the fight. The Moors, smaller in number, were disciplined and inspired. The clash raged for days, cavalry slamming infantry, dust hiding chaos. Then came the collapse. Parts of Roderick's army deserted mid-battle. Some say they fled, others that they betrayed him. Roderick vanished, some claimed drowned, others exiled. Whatever the truth, the kingdom was broken. After Guadalete, Muslim forces swept the peninsula. Toledo surrendered quickly. For the Visigoths, it was the end. For the Moors, it was the beginning of centuries in Spain. Imagine being a villager raised under Visigothic kings, suddenly living under new rulers. New faith, a new order. It was a cultural earthquake. And yet, the Visigoths didn't vanish. Their laws, nobles, and church endured, feeding into Christian kingdoms of the north. In Aureus, the spark of Covadonga rose from survivors. So Guadalete wasn't just a lost battle. It opened the door to medieval Spain Cordoba's mosques, the reconquista elid, everything traced back to that river battlefield when the kingdom fell and history turned. And the strangest part, it all began with weakness within. The invaders were bold, but the cracks were already there. Guadalete reminds us, sometimes the fiercest enemy isn't outside, it's the divisions within. Cordoba, birth of a dazzling Muslim capital. Picture this. It's the middle of the 8th century, and a man has just crossed the sea, fleeing a massacre that wiped out nearly his entire family. His name is Abd al-Rahman, the last surviving prince of the Umayyads. Everyone else from his royal line had been hunted down by their rivals, the Abbasids, far away in Damascus. He arrived in Iberia, Spain, with almost nothing but a claim to power, charisma, and a dream. Nobody could have guessed that this fugitive would turn a provincial corner of the Islamic world into one of medieval history's most dazzling capitals. Cordoba. Before Abd al-Rahman, Cordoba wasn't impressive. Once Roman, it had faded under Visigothic rule, crumbling walls, dusty streets, and little glory. But Abd al-Rahman saw opportunity. He rallied Berber troops, defeated rivals, and by 756 declared himself Emir of Cordoba. A refugee turned ruler of a brand new emirate. Over the next century, Cordoba blossomed. By the 10th century, Abd al-Rahman III declared the caliphate of Cordoba, and the city had become the jewel of al-Andalus. Imagine walking its streets at night. While most of Europe went dark, Cordoba glowed with thousands of lamps. People said you could walk across the city without losing sight of their light. It wasn't just size, though, with perhaps 500,000 people. It rivaled Constantinople and Baghdad. It was culture. Markets overflowed with silks, spices, and books. While European monasteries held a few hundred texts, Coard's libraries contained hundreds of thousands. Knowledge from Greece, Persia, and India flowed in, translated, and expanded. Then the architecture, the great mosque with its endless red and white arches begun by Abd al-Rahman IV and expanded by successors. Not just a mosque, but a statement of faith and power. And it wasn't only Muslims. Christians and Jews thrived too as doctors, translators, and scholars. The conventia wasn't perfect, but it fostered exchange. Think of Maimonides raised here, or Christian scholars who carried learning north and helped ignite Europe's Renaissance. Cordoba's golden age ended in the 11th century with civil wars and taifa kingdoms. Yet its brilliance lingered when Toledo fell in 1085. Many books and scholars moved there, keeping Cordoba's legacy alive. More than knights and castles, medieval Spain's heartbeat was Cordoba. Its lamps, its arches, its libraries. A refugee prince had turned a forgotten city into a beacon, reminding us how fragile greatness is and how vision can light up an age. The caliphate's golden age of learning and architecture. Imagine walking through a city in the early 10th century, where lamps flicker along clean-paved streets, where running water flows into public baths, and where scholars debate the secrets of the stars in libraries larger than most entire European towns. That city was Cordoba, and for a time it was the jewel of the Western world. When people later called it the ornament of the world, they weren't exaggerating. At its height, the Caliphate of Cordoba shone with a brilliance that seemed almost out of place in what many still call the Dark Ages. Europe north of the Pyrenees was fractured into small kingdoms, castles on muddy hills, and monasteries guarding scraps of old Roman knowledge. But here in Spain, under Muslim rule, Cordoba grew into a capital of light. The streets had oil lamps long before Paris or London. Public baths numbered in the hundreds, fountains cooled courtyards, and markets hummed with spices from Africa, silk from the East, and fine leather crafted by local artisans. What set Cordoba apart was its passion for knowledge. Caliphs like Abd al-Rahman III and his son al-Hakam II weren't just rulers. They were patrons of learning. Al-Hakam's library is said to have held hundreds of thousands of volumes, perhaps nearly 500,000. To compare, most monasteries in Christian Europe had fewer than 100 read books. No wonder scholars, translators, doctors, poets, and astronomers flocked to Cordoba from faraway lands. And this thirst for knowledge wasn't limited to Muslims. Jews and Christians under Muslim rule also contributed. They translated preserved ancient texts and added their own insights. Greek works of Aristotle and Galen, nearly lost in the West, survived through Arabic translations here before reaching Latin. Later, Toledo's famous translation movement built directly on Cordoba's brilliance. Cordoba's golden age also shone in architecture. The Great Mosque still amazes visitors today with its endless red and white arches, a blend of Roman engineering and Islamic design. The Mikra, its prayer niche, glitters with Byzantine mosaic centers' imperial gifts, proof of the city's wide influence. Imagine kneeling there as sunlight streamed through horseshoe arches. It must have felt like entering another world. And Cordoba was not alone. Across Al-Andalus, palaces and gardens rose that reflected a refined vision of paradise on earth. The most famous was Madinat al-Zahra, the shining city built just outside Cordoba by Abd al-Rahman III. Picture white marble halls, pools reflecting the Andalusian sky, and carved stucco walls that seemed almost lace-like in their delicacy. Diplomats from across Europe visited this city and left stunned accounts of its grandeur. Sadly, Madinat al-Zahra did not last within a few generations. It was looted and abandoned, a symbol of how quickly fortune could turn. But its ruins still whisper of that lost brilliance. Of course, golden ages don't last forever. After al-Hakam's reign, Cordoba slipped into civil war, and the great caliphate fragmented into smaller taifa kingdoms. Those tires carried some of the cultural torch forward, but the unified brilliance of Cordoba was never matched again. Still, the memory of its libraries, its scholars, and its architecture lingered like an echo, inspiring later generations. When Christian kingdoms pushed southward, they didn't just destroy, they absorbed. Many cathedrals were built atop or even within old mosques, carrying forward architectural styles that became uniquely Spanish. It's also worth noting how this golden age set the stage for tension later. The very success of Cordoba, its wealth, its learning, its beauty, made it a prize for Christian kings hungry to expand. When Toledo fell in the 11th century, much of the treasure seized was intellectual manuscripts, scholars, and translators. In that sense, Coard's brilliance didn't die. It spread, reshaping not only Spain, but eventually the entire course of European history. Looking back, the Caliphate's golden age feels almost like a dream. Imagine the hum of debates in the libraries, the smell of orange blossoms in palace gardens, the sight of glittering mosaics under candlelight. Cordoba reminds us that history isn't a straight line of progress or decline. It's a tapestry of brilliance and collapse, woven again and again. And this particular thread, shimmering with learning and architecture, still catches the light centuries later. Christian kingdoms survive in the northern mountains. When the Visigothic kingdom fell so suddenly to the Moors in the year 701, it seemed as though all of Spain had been swept away in a single storm. Cities that had once been the heart of Visigothic power crumbled under the weight of Tariq ibn Ziyad's armies. Cordoba, Toledo, Merida, one after another, they fell. But not everything was lost. In the wild, rugged north, where the mountains pressed against the sky and the valleys were narrow and harsh, a flicker of resistance remained. That flicker would grow into a flame that burned for centuries. The northern mountains of Spain were a world apart from the fertile plains of the south. Steep ridges, deep forests, and stormy coasts gave this land a sense of isolation. Life here was tough. Survival demanded resilience, and that very harshness provided protection. The Moors, who swept through the heart of Iberia with lightning speed, found the north far less inviting. To conquer every crag and valley would have required immense effort, and so these regions remained beyond their firm grasp. It was here, in these rocky refuges, that small Christian enclaves began to rebuild what had been lost. Think about it. To the outside world, it must have looked as though Islam's victory in Iberia was complete. Yet in places like Asturias, Cantabria, and Navarre, communities refused to bow. They clung to the memory of their old faith and the idea of a kingdom that had not truly died. These were not grand realms at first, more like mountain fortresses, bands of warriors, families and villages clustered together, hiding behind stone walls or the sheer difficulty of the landscape. But in time, they began to see themselves not just as survivors, but as heirs to a mission to carry on Christian Spain in exile. The story of Paleo, the noble who supposedly rallied fighters at the Battle of Covadonga, belongs to this chapter. Whether legend or history, the tale captures the spirit of the moment. Surrounded by mountains with the odds stacked against them, a small group of warriors pushed back the Moors. It was not a massive battle, nothing like Guadalete, but symbolically it mattered. It said, "We are still here. We have not been erased." This spirit shaped the rise of the tiny kingdom of Asturias, which saw itself as the seed of a reborn Spain. These mountain kingdoms were never safe. Raids swept through their lands. Moorish armies marched north to punish their defiance, and alliances often shifted with the changing winds. Yet the geography always gave them an advantage. The Moors could win victories, but they could not hold the mountains forever. And slowly, year by year, the Christians began to consolidate their power. What started as survival grew into ambition. They began to build churches, issue charters, and claim the legacy of the Visigothic kings. It's important to see how fragile and fragmented these early kingdoms were. Asturias, Leon, Navarre, Aragon, each would eventually claim its place in the long story of Spain. But in the 8th and 9th centuries, they were like seeds planted in rocky soil, struggling to grow but never entirely dying out. Their leaders forged alliances with local lords, fought among themselves as much as against their Moorish neighbors. And yet through all the chaos the idea of Christian Spain endured, that idea became their banner. And here's where the story ties into the bigger picture. Remember how the Moors, after their first wave of conquest, eventually fractured into rival tires? That division would come later, but it mirrors the fragility of these Christian enclaves. Both sides were fragmented, both vulnerable. Yet for the Christians, their weakness also gave them flexibility. They could bend without breaking, retreat into the mountains when needed, and wait for the moment when fortune tilted in their favor. In the grand sweep of history, it's easy to look ahead to Toledo's capture, to El Cid's battles, to the fall of Granada centuries later. But none of that would have been possible without these mountain strongholds. Without Arius holding on, without Navarre building its resilience, without Aragon carving out a frontier, there might never have been a reconquista at all. These were the first sparks, fragile but stubborn, that lit the long fire of resistance. So imagine those mountain valleys, smoke rising from stone houses, bells ringing from small wooden churches, warriors keeping watch on high ridges as Moorish patrols passed below. These people lived with constant danger, but also with an unshakable belief that they were carrying something forward, a memory, a faith, and a dream of a kingdom that would rise again. They didn't know it yet, but their survival was the beginning of a story that would last for centuries. The slow, relentless push south that we remember today as the Reconquista, the rise of Arius, and the legend of Covadonga. High in the misty mountains of northern Spain, where steep cliffs meet rushing rivers and valleys curl into the clouds, a spark of resistance was lit in the early 8th century. The year was not long after Tariq ibn Ziyad's stunning invasion had toppled the Visigothic kingdom, leaving most of Iberia under Muslim rule. Yet in these rugged landscapes, far from the great plains and glittering cities, a handful of survivors would write the opening lines of a story that would stretch for centuries, the Reconquista. And at its heart was a battle remembered less for its scale than for its symbolism, the legend of Covadonga. To imagine the rise of Asturias, you have to picture Spain in the aftermath of 711. The Visigothic crown had crumbled after the Battle of Guadalete. Toledo, Cordoba, and Seville fell quickly. For ordinary people, the new rulers of Al-Andalus seemed unstoppable, but the north was different. The Cantabrian and Aurian mountains were wild, difficult terrain where even Rome had struggled to fully impose its will. Here, small communities held tight to old traditions. And here, survivors of Visigothic nobility and soldiers retreated to regroup. One of them was a man named Peleo, sometimes described as a noble of Visigothic blood, other times as a local chief. His life before Covadonga is wrapped in mystery. But what matters is that he became the figure around whom discontent and hope gathered. To the local Aurans, he was not just a leader, but a rallying point, someone who dared to say that the Moors could be resisted. In a world where defeat had seemed total, that was a radical belief. The clash at Covadonga came around the year 722. Though exact dates are debated, Muslim forces determined to crush this pocket of resistance marched into the mountains. What they found was not an open battlefield, but a narrow gorge where Peleo and his followers prepared their stand. Imagine it. Steep cliffs rising like walls, echoing caves, and warriors hidden among rocks, waiting for the enemy to press forward. It was not the size of Peleo's force that mattered by most accounts. They were vastly outnumbered, but the terrain, the will to fight, and perhaps the conviction that history itself was on their side. Legend says the battle turned in miraculous fashion. Arrows and stones hurled by the Muslims struck the cliffs and bounced back as if nature itself protected the historians. From their position, Peleo's men rained down attacks, and the invaders, unable to maneuver, faltered. What began as a skirmish turned into a rout. The survivors fled, and the mountains were left in Christian hands. Covadonga was no great military conquest compared to Guadalete or Cordoba, but symbolically, it was thunder. For the first time since the shock of 711, someone had pushed back. From this victory rose the tiny kingdom of Asturias. At first, it was little more than a cluster of valleys and fortresses, but its importance was immense. It proved that resistance was possible. Over time, Asturias grew into a beacon for Christian refugees from the south, a fragile yet enduring base of power, while Muslim Cordoba was rising into a dazzling capital of al-Andalus in the north. A different vision of Spain was quietly forming. Covadonga became more than just a memory. It turned into a legend, a story told and retold to inspire generations. Chroniclers painted Pelayo as a chosen leader, divinely guided to defend Christianity in Spain. Later, kings of Leon and Castile would trace their lineage back to him, using the myth of Covadonga as proof that their cause was not just political, but sacred. Even centuries later, when castles dotted the land and crusader knights marched under papal banners, the tale of Pelayo's stand in the mountains still echoed. What makes this moment even more fascinating is how it connects to both the past and the future. Pelayo's defiance was rooted in the ruins of the Visigothic kingdom. He and his men carried fragments of that broken order into the mountains, but his victory also laid the groundwork for what came after, the slow, uneven, but relentless reconquista. Remember how we spoke of Tar's invasion as a shock? Covadonga was the first shock in the opposite direction. Tiny compared to the armies of al-Andalus, but immense in meaning. Aureus itself would never be the grand center that Cordoba was, nor did it match the splendor of later realms like Castile or Aragon. Yet it mattered because it endured. From its narrow valleys grew a line of kingdoms that eventually pushed southward, one ridge, one plain, one city at a time. Without that first stand, the story of medieval Spain might have been very different. And so high in the misty mountains, a legend was born. The Moors had swept across Spain like a tide, but in the gorge of Covadonga, the tide met a rock, small, stubborn, immovable. From that rock rose Aureus, and with it, the dream of a different Spain, Frankish frontiers, and the creation of the Spanish March. Imagine riding along the rugged Pyrenean valleys in the early 9th century. To the north, the lands of the Franks, ruled by a dynasty whose power stretched from the Atlantic to the Alps. To the south, Al-Andalus, the Muslim-ruled territory of Iberia. Between them lay a wild, unstable borderland where neither side could fully claim control. This border would become something new, something carved out of war, politics, and survival. The Spanish March. The story begins with Charlemagne, the great Frankish king whose empire was ambitious enough to rival Rome's. Charlemagne dreamed of pushing his influence beyond the Pyrenees. He wanted a protective buffer zone that would keep the power of Cordoba at arm's length. But this was no simple expansion. The Franks had learned often the hard way that Iberia was not an easy prize. In fact, one of the most famous disasters of Charlemagne's reign happened when he first tried to move into Spain. That disaster was the retreat from Zaragoza in the year 778. Charlemagne's army had crossed into Iberia, hoping to capture the city, but the campaign fell apart. On their way back through the mountains, the rear guard of his forces was ambushed at Ronels by Basque fighters. It was there that Roland, a heroic figure in later legend, met his end. The Song of Roland would transform that ambush into a tale of knightly sacrifice, but in truth, it was a bitter lesson. Spain would not be conquered so easily, yet Charlemagne didn't give up. Instead of marching blindly into the heart of al-Andalus, he shifted strategy. He began building a frontier zone south of the Pyrenees. Rather than a single conquest, it would be a patchwork of counties and fortified towns. Each was ruled by a count loyal to the Franks, tasked with defending the border against Muslim raids. Over time, this buffer came to be called the Spanish March. Counties like Barcelona, Girona, and Urgell became the backbone of this frontier. Their leaders were expected to hold strong against sudden attacks, but they also had a surprising degree of independence. Far from the Frankish heartlands, they acted almost like little kingdoms, balancing loyalty to their overlords with the realities of local power. In practice, the march was less about central control and more about creating a network of defensive outposts, strong enough to slow down enemies and give the Franks breathing room. The Spanish March wasn't just a military invention, it was also a cultural crossroads. The Pyrenees had always been a meeting place of peoples: Franks, Goths, Basques, and the Muslim forces pressing from the south. Farmers rebuilt villages among ruined Roman roads. Traders carried goods across the mountains, blending influences from both worlds. Over time, this region developed its own identity, shaped by constant tension and constant exchange. And then there was Barcelona. In the early 9th century, Frankish forces captured the city, turning it into a key stronghold of the march. Its counts would eventually gain more autonomy, slowly laying the foundations for what would later become Catalonia. So when we think of the Spanish March, it isn't just a forgotten frontier. It's the seedbed of future kingdoms. This frontier also connected deeply to the wider story of the reconquista. While Christian resistance in Arias and Leon was growing in the northwestern mountains, the march represented another path of survival and expansion. Together, these scattered Christian enclaves would one day link into a broader movement, reclaiming lands from Muslim rule. The survival of these fragile borders mattered more than anyone at the time could guess, but life on the march was far from easy. Raids and counter-raids were constant. A farmer might sow fields in spring only to see them burned by summer. Castles rose along the hills, their towers watching for the dust of enemy riders. The people of the march lived with one foot in war and the other in fragile peace. And yet, in that struggle, communities hardened and identities deepened. Looking back, the creation of the Spanish March feels like a small detail compared to the grandeur of Cordoba's palaces or the later fall of Granada. But in truth, it was essential. Without that frontier, the Franks might never have secured a foothold beyond the Pyrenees. Without Barcelona and its counties, the Christian push into Iberia might have been delayed or broken entirely. So the Spanish March was not just a buffer, it was a spark. A thin line of fortresses and loyal counts standing between two civilizations. It became the foundation for the future of Catalonia and an early piece of the long winding puzzle that would become medieval Spain. The clash at Guadalete opened the door. Cordoba lit the southern skies. But here in the shadow of the Pyrenees, another chapter was being written quietly, stubbornly, and with consequences that would echo for centuries. In the shadow of Coard's glittering rise, 3 small Christian realms in the north were slowly shaping their own paths. They didn't have the vast libraries, the glowing lamps, or the endless arches of a great mosque. What they had instead were rugged mountains, thick forests, and a stubborn determination to survive. These kingdoms, Leon, Navarre, and Aragon, might have looked weak compared to the Muslim south, but they were laying foundations that would eventually tilt the balance of Spain's destiny. Let's start with Leon. It grew out of the old Asturian kingdom, that small spark of resistance we talked about earlier at Covadonga. By the 10th century, Leon had become the leading Christian kingdom on the peninsula. Its kings claimed not only political authority but also a special legacy. They saw themselves as heirs of the old Visigothic rulers who had once commanded all of Spain. This wasn't just about power, it was about identity. In their minds, Leon was more than a mountain kingdom. It was the rightful core of a reborn Christian Hispania. That sense of destiny gave them confidence. Even when they stood face to face with the might of Al-Andalus, Navarre, tucked away in the Pyrenees, took a different path. Its kings had to balance carefully between powerful neighbors, the Franks to the north, Leon to the west, and the Muslim states to the south. But Navarre's geography gave it an advantage. The mountain passes of the Pyrenees were both a shield and a gateway linking Iberia to the rest of Europe. This made Navarre a crossroads, small but strategically important. By the early 11th century, Navarre's rulers managed to expand influence over neighboring lands, and for a brief moment, under Sancho the Great, Navarre looked like it might even dominate northern Spain. Sancho's realm stretched far beyond what you'd expect for a mountain kingdom. But after his death, it fragmented, leaving Navarre once again pressed between larger forces. Still, the legacy of that expansion showed that even small kingdoms could dream big. Then there was Aragon, the youngest of the three. Born in the high valleys of the central Pyrenees, it started as little more than a cluster of counties under Frankish influence. At first, it hardly seemed destined for greatness, but Aragon's position on the frontier meant it was always in motion, pushing outward, testing its strength, carving space where it could. By the 11th and 12th centuries, Aragon would begin to step onto the larger stage, especially when it joined with Catalonia through marriage alliances. But even in its early days, you can sense the ambition taking root. A small mountain county was preparing to grow into a kingdom that would one day help lead the reconquista. What ties these three together is not just geography, but resilience. While the caliphate of Cordoba dazzled with wealth and culture, these northern kingdoms played the long game. They built stone fortresses along ridges, cultivated loyalty among local lords, and slowly pushed their borders south. Their victories often came not through grand battles, but through persistence, retaking valleys, holding new ground, and then building upon it. When the caliphate eventually fractured into rival taifas, Leon, Navarre, and Aragon were already positioned to seize the moment. It's fascinating to think of these kingdoms as both rivals and reluctant allies. They competed fiercely, sometimes even fighting each other more than the Moors. But they also shared a broader vision, the hope that one day Christian power would stretch across the peninsula again. That dream was centuries away. But every skirmish, every treaty, every castle on a hill was a step in that direction. Their stories would later intertwine with other forces. Leon's traditions would feed into the powerful kingdom of Castile. Navarre would hold on to its independence longer than anyone might expect, even as larger neighbors pressed in. Aragon, through expansion and union, would eventually stand shoulder to shoulder with Castile in shaping the final reconquista. None of that could have been guessed in their early centuries, when survival alone seemed like victory. And yet survival was enough. In those early days, to endure was to win. These kingdoms carried forward a memory of the Visigoths, a belief in Christian restoration, and a stubborn refusal to be erased. They were small candles flickering against the brilliance of Cordoba. But candles can outlast lamps if they burn steadily. So when we look at the grand sweep of medieval Spain, it's easy to get caught up in the glamour of Al-Andalus. But without Leon, Navarre, and Aragon quietly carving their destinies in the mountains, there would have been no balance, no eventual reconquista, no united Spain centuries later. These were the roots, hidden but strong, waiting for their moment to grow. Imagine a glittering glass goblet suddenly drop to the floor. For a moment, it dazzles with beauty, but then it shatters into dozens of smaller pieces. That's exactly what happened to Al-Andalus after the fall of the Cordoba Caliphate. What had once been a unified and powerful Muslim kingdom, a beacon of learning and architecture, cracked apart into tiny rival states known as taifas. Each piece sparkled in its own way, but none could ever match the brilliance of the whole. The collapse began in the early 11th century. After years of internal conflict, weak leadership, and civil wars known as the Fitna, Cordoba could no longer hold together its sprawling territories. By the year 1031, the Great Caliphate was finished, and the once mighty empire splintered into about 35 independent taifas. Some were ruled by Arab elites, others by Berbers, and still others by Slavic freedmen who had risen to unexpected power. At first glance, this didn't seem entirely bad. Many of the taifas became vibrant cultural centers, competing with one another in art, poetry, and architecture. Places like Seville, Zaragoza, Toledo, and Granada blossomed with their own courts and palaces. Rulers eager to show off their legitimacy invited poets, philosophers, and musicians to their courts, hoping to outshine their rivals. Imagine wandering through Seville in this period, the air alive with music, poets reciting verses under lantern light, while artisans built new mosques and gardens. In a strange way, fragmentation created a burst of creativity, but politically, the division was disastrous. Each taifa was too small and too weak to resist pressure from the growing Christian kingdoms in the north: Leon, Castile, Navarre, and Aragon. Those mountain realms that had once seemed minor saw opportunity in the South's disunity. They pushed steadily forward, seizing fortresses and demanding tribute. Taifa rulers often found themselves paying large sums called pariahs to Christian kings in exchange for peace. The irony was painful. The taifas, heirs to Coard's glittering wealth, were now financing the very enemies who would eventually conquer them. The taifa rulers weren't blind to the danger, but rivalries often outweighed unity. Seville might ally with Castile to weaken Toledo, while Zaragoza might pay tribute to Aragon to keep Granada in check. These shifting alliances bought temporary safety, but at a terrible long-term cost. By the middle of the 11th century, Christian rulers had grown rich and powerful on the gold flowing from Al-Andalus. Remember how Toledo later became a decisive turning point? The seeds of that victory were planted here in the era of taifa disunity. Still, we shouldn't think only in terms of decline. The taifas carried forward much of the cultural torch lit by Cordoba's golden age. Toledo, before its capture, became a hub where Muslim, Jewish, and Christian scholars worked side by side. In Seville, the poet King Al-Mutamid left a legacy of verse that still echoes through Spanish literature. Even smaller taifas left their mark with dazzling palaces and gardens that hinted at lost paradise. The tragedy was that such brilliance unfolded under the shadow of looming conquest. By the late 11th century, many taifa rulers realized they could no longer survive on their own. Some turned to distant Muslim powers for help, inviting the almoravids from North Africa to intervene. It was a desperate gamble, trading independence for protection, but it shows how fragile the taifas had become. The arrival of the almoravids brought new waves of reform and stricter rule. But that's a story for another time. For now, what matters is that the dream of a unified Al-Andalus had been broken, and the shards lay scattered across the Iberian Peninsula. The tale of the taifas feels bittersweet. On one hand, they gave us music, poetry, and architecture that might never have existed without their rivalry. On the other, their weakness opened the door for Christian kings to turn the tide of history. It's almost as if their brilliance was a final blaze before the darkness of conquest closed in. And yet, even in their downfall, the taifas remind us of the fragile balance between unity and division, how easily greatness can crumble, and how even in fragments, beauty can endure. Picture the year 1085. For centuries, the Christians in the north had fought, retreated, regrouped, and pushed south again in a slow tug-of-war against the Muslim rulers of Al-Andalus. Victories had been won, but none had shaken the balance of power the way what happened that year did. When King Alfonso VI of Leon and Castile marched into Toledo, the old Visigothic capital, the news echoed across Europe. This wasn't just another fortress taken or another patch of farmland gained. This was symbolic, almost mythic. The Christians had seized the very heart of Spain. Toledo was no ordinary city. Perched on a rocky hill encircled on three sides by the Tagus River, it had once been the crown jewel of the Visigothic kingdom, before the Moors stormed in during the year 711. For centuries afterward, it remained a vital center of Muslim Spain, thriving under rulers of Al-Andalus and later the fragmented taifas. When Alfonso claimed it, he wasn't just winning a prize, he was reclaiming a capital that his people saw as rightfully theirs. The old Visigothic dream was reborn. But let's back up a little. By the mid-11th century, Al-Andalus had broken apart into rival taifas, small kingdoms led by ambitious rulers who often fought one another as fiercely as they fought the Christians. This fragmentation gave Alfonso his chance. The taifa of Toledo, caught in political struggles and unable to withstand pressure from both neighbors and northern armies, became vulnerable. Some Muslim leaders even preferred to hand the city to Alfonso through negotiation, rather than risk falling into the hands of rival taifas or the harsher powers of the almoravids waiting across the straits in North Africa. So when Alfonso marched south, it wasn't just with sword and shield. It was also with promises and diplomacy. He assured Toledo's Muslim population that their lives, property, and mosques would be respected. The Christians who had lived under Muslim rule now found themselves on the other side of history, and Toledo became a melting pot where cultures collided and coexisted. Of course, tensions simmered, and the promises weren't always kept perfectly, but the city stood as a living example of the complicated blend of peoples that defined medieval Spain. The impact of Toledo's capture was enormous. For one, it gave Christian Spain a new political and symbolic center. Alfonso shifted his capital there, and from Toledo, he projected his authority over the expanding lands of Castile and Leon. The city's location right in the center of the peninsula made it the perfect hub for further expansion. Every Christian campaign southward after this seemed to trace back to that moment, the moment Toledo fell into Christian hands. And the symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. To Christian Europe, this was proof that the reconquista wasn't a hopeless dream, but a living reality. Pilgrims traveling the Camino to Santiago de Compostela carried stories of the victory home, and the papacy took notice. When the Crusades began in the Holy Land just a decade later, the struggles of Spain were linked in spirit, blessed by the same religious fervor. The capture of Toledo helped plant the idea that the Iberian Wars were part of a broader Christian struggle, not just a local feud. But there was another side to the story. The Muslim world reeled at the loss. Toledo had been more than a city. It was a beacon of Andalusi culture, learning, and power. Its fall sent shockwaves across Al-Andalus and made clear that the Christian kingdoms were no longer just mountain enclaves nibbling at the edges. They were serious contenders. The Almoravids, seeing the danger, soon crossed from North Africa to reinforce Muslim rule. Their arrival would spark new conflicts and bring waves of reform and rigidity that reshaped Al-Andalus. So while Toledo marked triumph for the Christians, it also set the stage for fiercer wars to come. Culturally, Toledo blossomed in ways no one could have predicted. Under Christian rule, it became a crossroads of translation and knowledge. The famed school of translators brought together Muslim, Jewish, and Christian scholars who rendered Arabic texts, themselves translations of Greek and Persian works, into Latin. Through Toledo, Europe rediscovered Aristotle, Galen, and countless other thinkers. The city became a bridge carrying wisdom from the ancient world into the Middle Ages, feeding the coming renaissance of European learning. Think of it this way. If the small victory at Covadonga had been the first spark of resistance, Toledo was the roaring fire that lit up the peninsula. It told every Christian ruler from Aragon to Navarre that the south could be taken, that the dream was possible. It also told the Moors that their hold on Spain was not eternal. That dual realization would shape the next centuries of warfare, alliances, and betrayals. So when you hear of Toledo's capture, don't think of it as just another fortress falling in medieval times. It was a pivot point, a heartbeat that shifted the rhythm of the whole story. The Christian kingdoms, once huddled in northern mountains, were now stepping boldly into the center of the peninsula. The reconquista had crossed a line, and Spain would never be the same. By the late 11th century, Al-Andalus was not the unified power it had once been. The great caliphate of Cordoba had shattered into rival taifa kingdoms, each ruled by ambitious local leaders. On the surface, this was a golden opportunity for the Christian kingdoms of the north. They pushed southward, testing the strength of their fragmented neighbors. Yet in the Muslim world, news of these defeats and divisions stirred alarm, and from across the strait in North Africa came movements that promised not just military strength, but moral reform. First the Almoravids, then the Almohads. Two dynasties forged in the desert, burning with zeal and determined to reshape Iberia in their vision. The Almoravids rose from the sands of the Sahara in the 11th century. Picture nomadic tribes under the leadership of Yusuf ibn Tashfin. Guided by a fierce religious mission to purify Islam, they saw the Taifa rulers of Al-Andalus as decadent, weakened by luxury, and too willing to compromise with Christian kings. When desperate Taifa rulers invited them to help repel Alfonso VI of Castile, the king who had just captured Toledo in 1085, a turning point we'll explore later, the Almoravids answered. In 1086, Yusuf ibn Tashfin crossed into Spain with a disciplined army. At the Battle of Sagrias, his forces dealt Alfonso a crushing defeat. It was a shockwave across Iberia. Suddenly, the Christians realized they were no longer fighting fractured city-states, but a formidable empire rooted in the deserts of Africa. For the Muslims of Al-Andalus, the Almoravids offered protection, but also strict reform. They imposed unity, curbed the excesses of Taifa courts, and reintroduced a sterner, more austere interpretation of Islam. But time wears on even the most zealous movements. The Almoravids, who began as desert reformers, eventually built palaces and adopted the trappings of power. Their grip weakened. Out of the Atlas Mountains rose a new force, the Almohads. If the Almoravids had been strict, the Almohads were uncompromising. Founded in the 12th century by Ibn Tumart, who claimed to be the Mahdi, They declared that even the almoravids had strayed from true faith. The almohads burned with the idea of absolute unity under a purified Islam. When they swept into Iberia in the mid-12th century, they brought not only armies but sweeping reforms. Their rule was harsher, their religious policies stricter. For Jews and Christians, who had often lived with relative tolerance under earlier Muslim dynasties, life under the Almohads was far less forgiving. Many fled northward into Christian lands. At the same time, the Almohads revitalized Muslim resistance against the growing momentum of the reconquista. One of their greatest victories came at the Battle of Alarcos in 1195. There they crushed the forces of Castile, proving they were still a formidable barrier against Christian expansion. But history often turns on moments of reversal. Just 17 years later, in 1212, the Almohads faced a united Christian front at the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa. It was one of the most decisive battles of the Middle Ages in Spain. The Christian kingdoms, long divided, had come together under papal blessing, and this time the Almohads were the ones shattered. Their defeat marked the beginning of the end of Muslim dominance in much of Iberia. Yet the impact of the Almoravids and Almohads wasn't just military. They left deep cultural and architectural marks. Almoravid rule reinforced ties between Al-Andalus and North Africa, bringing new styles of art, new religious scholarship, and fortified defenses that dotted the landscape. The Almohads, meanwhile, gave us monuments like the Giralda in Seville, originally built as a minaret and still standing as one of Spain's iconic landmarks. Their vision of unity and reform left lasting imprints even as their empire fractured. Looking back, their story feels like waves crashing onto Iberia. The first wave, the Almoravids, surged in with discipline and reform, holding back Christian advances. The second wave, the Almohads, came fiercer and higher, sweeping across Spain with zeal before breaking on the rocks of united Christian resistance. Together they extended the life of Muslim Spain for centuries, buying time for the brilliance of Al-Andalus to shine longer, even as pressures mounted. And remember, while the Almoravids and Almohads came from Africa, their story became inseparable from Spain's. Their rise and fall intertwined with the fate of Castile, Aragon, and Leon, with the legends of El Cid, and with the reconquista crusades blessed by Rome. Their reforms reshaped lives, faith, and politics on both sides of the strait. In the end, their zeal carried them far, but it could not last forever. The mountains and valleys of Iberia would once again shift, the balance tipping steadily toward the Christian kingdoms. Yet without the Almoravids and Almohads, the medieval story of Spain would be far shorter, far less contested, and far less dramatic. They were the storm fronts that rolled in from the desert, leaving the land forever changed. Picture a dusty plain in Iberia during the 11th century. Two armies face one another, one carrying banners marked with the cross, the other with the crescent. Priests walk among the soldiers, blessing them before battle. These wars weren't just about kings claiming land anymore. They were wars declared holy, fought with the promise of spiritual reward. Iberia had become one of the main stages of the Crusades even before many knights had ever seen the walls of Jerusalem. By this time, the reconquista was already underway. Christian kingdoms in the north, Asturias, Leon, Navarre, Aragon, and especially Castile, had been pushing against Muslim-ruled Al-Andalus for centuries. But what had once been a series of border struggles began to take on a new meaning in the eyes of the Church. As the papacy grew in power during the 11th century, it saw Iberia as more than just local politics. It was another front line in the great struggle between Christianity and Islam. The idea of holy war gained momentum with Pope Alexander II. In the year 1063, he granted indulgences, spiritual pardons of sins, to French knights who came to fight in Spain. This was decades before Pope Urban II called the First Crusade in 1095. In a sense, Iberia was a testing ground. Knights who fought here were promised the same blessings they would later be offered for marching to the Holy Land. The message was clear. War in Spain was not just politics. It was God's work. This papal approval changed everything. Suddenly, Christian rulers in Spain could call on allies from across Europe. French knights hungry for both glory and salvation rode across the Pyrenees to join the fight. Monasteries and churches spread the message that dying in these battles was martyrdom, a direct ticket to heaven. The reconquista now carried the same aura of sacred duty that cloaked the Crusades in the East. One of the earliest and most dramatic examples was the siege of Barbastro in 1064. Papal blessing brought a coalition of Christian forces from France and Italy into Spain, and together with local rulers, they stormed the city. The victory was brutal. Thousands killed, captives taken, churches established where mosques had stood. To many, it proved that papal approval could rally Europe to Iberia's cause. It also foreshadowed the ferocity that would later define the Crusades. Over the next centuries, this blending of Reconquista and Crusade only deepened. When Urban II launched the First Crusade, Iberian rulers quickly reminded him that their wars were just as holy as those in the Levant, and the papacy agreed. Bulls and decrees flowed from Rome, offering the same indulgences to knights who fought in Spain as to those who fought in Jerusalem. For many warriors, Iberia was even more appealing. It was closer, easier to reach, and promised rich lands as spoils. The 12th century saw this idea reach full force. The Great Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212 was framed as a crusade with armies from Castile, Aragon, and Navarre, joined by crusaders from beyond the Pyrenees. Priests carried relics into battle, and victory was celebrated not just as a political triumph, but as a divine sign. That victory broke the power of the almohads and opened vast stretches of Andalusian land to Christian advance. But crusading in Iberia wasn't only about war. It also shaped culture and politics. Orders of warrior monks like the Knights Templar and the Order of Santiago thrived in Spain, guarding frontiers and building castles. Pilgrimage routes, especially the Camino to Santiago, filled with travelers who saw Spain as a land where heaven touched earth. Even architecture and art reflected this fusion. Churches built like fortresses, painted with scenes of saints slaying enemies. Yet, as much as papal blessing brought unity, it also brought complications. European knights often came with their own ambitions, clashing with local rulers, and the wars, while called holy, were also about power, land, and wealth. Still, the language of crusade gave the Reconquista a special weight. It wasn't just Spain's struggle anymore, it was Christendom's. Looking back, it's striking how Iberia stood at the crossroads of two worlds. To the south, Cordoba and later Granada shone with Muslim culture and learning. To the north, kings raised banners of the cross, now backed by Rome itself. When we talk about the Crusades, we usually picture Jerusalem or Antioch, but Iberia was just as central. In fact, for many Europeans, the first crusade they ever joined was across the Pyrenees, not the Mediterranean. And so, the papal blessing transformed the Reconquista. What had begun as fractured wars between neighbors became something much larger. A holy struggle that tied Iberia to the spiritual map of medieval Europe. The clash at Guadalete had opened the door. The caliphate of Cordoba had dazzled the world. But now the reconquista carried the weight of heaven itself. For centuries to come, every campaign, every siege, every march south would echo with the promise of salvation. Sometimes history turns not on the battlefield, but at the altar. Imagine two crowns, two kingdoms with their own ambitions, rivalries, and traditions. For centuries, Castile and Aragon had gone their separate ways, sometimes fighting the Moors, sometimes quarreling with each other, always competing for dominance. And yet in the late 15th century, a single marriage would fuse their destinies, setting the stage for the birth of Spain as we know it. Castile was the larger and richer of the two. Born from Leon and hardened by endless wars on the frontier, Castile grew into the powerhouse of Christian Iberia. It controlled vast plains, perfect for grazing sheep, which meant wool, one of the most lucrative exports of medieval Europe. Castilian nobles grew wealthy, the crown became strong, and the kingdom expanded steadily southward, swallowing Muslim territories piece by piece. By the 15th century, Castile was formidable, but it was also turbulent. Noble families fought for influence, and the monarchy sometimes struggled to impose control. Aragon, on the other hand, was smaller in land, but wider in reach. What it lacked in sheep-filled plains, it made up for with Mediterranean ambition. Through a union with Catalonia, Aragon had gained access to powerful ports like Barcelona, and its ships sailed across the sea to Sicily, Sardinia, and Naples. Aragon was a kingdom of merchants and sailors, outward-looking and cosmopolitan. Its kings juggled a patchwork of territories, each with its own traditions and privileges. Unlike Castile, which leaned heavily on its nobility, Aragon was a federation of proud regions held together by a delicate balance. So you had two very different kingdoms, one anchored in the heart of Iberia, looking south toward Granada and the Reconquista. The other spread across the Mediterranean, thinking in terms of trade routes and overseas influence. They might have stayed apart forever if not for the marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile in 1469. It wasn't a fairy tale romance. It was politics at its sharpest. Their union didn't technically merge the two kingdoms into one, but it bound them so tightly that they began to act as a single power. The timing was crucial. The Muslim kingdom of Granada still held out in the south, but it was weakened and surrounded. With Castile's military might and Aragon's diplomatic connections, Ferdinand and Isabella launched a united campaign. Year by year, fortress by fortress, they closed in. Finally, in 1492, Granada fell. The Reconquista, centuries in the making, was complete. Castile and Aragon, once rivals, had together ended Moorish Spain. But their marriage did more than finish the Reconquista. It reshaped the political map of Europe. Isabella and Ferdinand centralized authority, reining in unruly nobles, strengthening royal councils, and building a monarchy with real teeth. They also turned their gaze outward. That same year, they agreed to sponsor a Genoese sailor with a bold idea, Christopher Columbus. His voyage across the Atlantic opened an entirely new chapter, transforming Castile and Aragon from regional powers into global empires. Still, the union wasn't seamless. Castile and Aragon kept their own laws, languages, and traditions. The marriage united crowns, not kingdoms. People in Barcelona didn't suddenly become Castilian, and nobles in Toledo didn't start caring about Sicilian affairs. Yet the vision of a greater Spain began here in this partnership. The crowns learned to pull in the same direction, and that momentum would carry forward for generations. It's worth remembering how fragile it all was. Before Isabella secured her throne, Castile had been racked by civil war. Before Ferdinand inherited Aragon, the crown was deeply entangled in Mediterranean rivalries. Their marriage steadied the storm, and while later centuries would bring new divisions, in the late 15th century, this union felt like destiny finally taking shape. Think about the symbolism, too. In Granada, when the last Muslim king handed over the keys of the city, Ferdinand and Isabella stood together. One sword, one crown, two kingdoms acting as one. It sent a message not only to their own subjects, but to the wider world. A new power had arrived on the stage of history. From here, everything accelerates. Spain as a global empire, the voyages of discovery, the rise of a monarchy that would dominate Europe. But at its heart, it all goes back to that marriage. Castile's strength on land, Aragon's strength at sea joined together. They became something far greater than either could have been alone. So when we speak of medieval Spain, we often think of battles, castles, and sieges. Yet the most powerful conquest of all came quietly, sealed not with swords, but with vows. Picture walking through the winding streets of medieval Toledo. The call to prayer drifts from a mosque. Church bells ring nearby, and in a small workshop, a Jewish scribe bends over parchment copying a text in Hebrew. In one city, three faiths lived side by side, sometimes uneasily, sometimes harmoniously, but always leaving traces on one another. This coexistence, often called convivencia, was one of the most remarkable features of medieval Spain. Al-Andalus had been built from the beginning as a layered society. Muslims held political and military power, but Christians and Jews were also deeply present, recognized as people of the book. They paid special taxes and lived under restrictions, but they were allowed to practice their faith, run their own communities, and contribute to the wider world. That balance produced a society where cultures rubbed shoulders daily, and the friction sometimes created sparks of brilliance. Take Cordoba during the caliphate's golden age. We've already talked about its vast libraries and love of knowledge. Well, many of the translators and scholars in those halls were not Muslim. Jewish thinkers, Christian monks, and Muslim philosophers all debated side by side. It was here that Greek philosophy found its second life. Aristotle, Galen, and Ptolemy came into Europe, not directly from Greek, but through Arabic translations, often refined by Jewish or Christian scholars. Without this cultural triangle, Europe's later Renaissance might never have happened. One of the brightest figures of this melting pot was Maimonides, a Jewish philosopher born in Cordoba in the 12th century. Forced to leave during times of persecution, he carried with him the spirit of Andalusian thought. His works blended Jewish theology with Aristotelian philosophy, deeply influencing both Jewish and Christian thinkers for centuries. Alongside him, Muslim scholars like Averroes wrestled with the same questions of reason and faith, leaving a legacy that spilled far beyond Spain. And then there were the craftsmen. If you walked into a palace or cathedral in medieval Spain, you would have seen the fingerprints of all three cultures. Muslims brought the horseshoe arch, intricate tile work, and geometric patterns. Jewish artisans specialized in delicate metalwork and calligraphy. Christians added Romanesque and later Gothic elements. Sometimes you even find all three blended in a single building. The synagogues of Toledo, for example, were built in a style so Islamic that they looked like mosques inside, except with Hebrew inscriptions covering the walls. Later, Christian conquerors would add chapels inside former mosques, creating a patchwork of faiths under one roof. Daily life reflected this mixture too. Languages bled into one another. Arabic was the language of prestige. Latin lingered in churches, and Hebrew thrived in Jewish quarters. Out of this contact came Mozarabic dialects spoken by Christians under Muslim rule, and later the Judeo-Spanish tongue carried by Sephardic Jews across the Mediterranean. Even food bore the marks of exchange: spices from Muslim trade routes, kosher traditions from Jews, and hearty stews from Christian kitchens, all ending up on shared tables. Of course, convivencia was never perfect harmony. It's easy to romanticize, but tensions were real. At times, Jews and Christians faced heavy taxes, forced conversions, or violent outbreaks. Periods of tolerance could quickly give way to repression, especially when political power shifted. The arrival of the almoravids and almohads with their stricter interpretations of Islam brought harsher rules that drove many Jews and Christians to flee northward. Yet, even in the north, in Christian kingdoms, Muslims and Jews often continued to play vital roles as translators, physicians, and advisors. This blending carried on as the reconquista advanced. When Toledo fell in the 11th century, Christian rulers didn't shut down the city's culture. Instead, they built on it, using Muslim and Jewish translators to pour Arabic knowledge into Latin. This work became Europe's doorway to medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy. Later, even El Cid, yes, that legendary Christian knight, fought alongside Muslim allies and navigated a world shaped by all three cultures. By the time Granada fell in 1492, the convivencia was already fraying. The Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, demanded religious unity. Jews were expelled, Muslims forced to convert or leave, and Spain's centuries-long experiment in coexistence was crushed. But the echoes never vanished. Spanish art, language, music, and even place names still carry the imprint of that time when three great faiths mingled under one sky. Looking back, the cultural melting pot of Jews, Christians, and Muslims in medieval Spain was not a utopia, but it was extraordinary. Out of friction came philosophy. Out of rivalry came architecture. Out of daily exchange came a richness of language and tradition. And even though the age of convivencia ended, its spirit still lingers, reminding us of what's possible when cultures meet, clash, and yet somehow create together. If you want to feel the heartbeat of medieval Spain, you don't need to read a dusty chronicle or memorize a list of kings. All you really need to do is walk through its stone and marble. The story of this land is carved into arches, towers, and courtyards. Each wall whispers of who built it, who conquered it, and who prayed within it. From the shimmering Alhambra to the towering cathedrals of Castile and the rugged castles that dot the hills, Spain's medieval architecture is like a living diary, one written in three voices: Muslim, Christian, and Jewish. Let's begin with the jewel of them all, the Alhambra. Rising above Granada like a dream caught in stone, it is the last and greatest masterpiece of Muslim Spain. Built and expanded during the 13th and 14th centuries under the Nasrid dynasty, the Alhambra wasn't just a fortress. It was a palace city, a place where rulers lived, surrounded by poetry turned into architecture. Imagine walking through its courtyards, delicate columns like a forest of stone, walls etched with verses from the Quran, fountains spilling water into pools that reflect the sky. The famous Court of the Lions, with its ring of slender arches and the marble lions guarding the fountain, feels like something out of another world. And in a sense, it was. A world of elegance built on the edge of collapse, the last flowering of Al-Andalus before Christian armies would close in. But while the Alhambra captured the brilliance of Muslim art, the Christians were writing their own story in stone. After the capture of Toledo in the 11th century and the steady march south, cathedrals began to rise like mountains of faith. They were not modest churches, but monuments meant to declare power and devotion at once. The Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela, with its Romanesque grandeur, became the destination for pilgrims from across Europe. Later, Gothic cathedrals soared even higher. Burgos with its lace-like spires, Leon with its stained glass that turned sunlight into rivers of color, Seville with its vast nave that seemed to stretch toward heaven itself. Each one told the same message. Christianity was here to stay, and it would reach for the sky. These cathedrals were more than religious spaces. They were gathering points, symbols of wealth, and statements of identity. Entire cities shaped themselves around them. Their construction took decades, sometimes centuries, with generations working on the same stones. Imagine being a stonemason, chiseling blocks you knew your grandchildren might not see finished. That kind of devotion shows the depth of meaning these buildings carried. Then there were the castles. Unlike the delicate palaces of Granada or the heavenly cathedrals of Castile, castles were blunt instruments of survival. They rose on rocky hills and along frontier lines built to withstand siege and announce dominance. From the castles of Navarre to the mighty Alcazar of Segovia, these fortresses tell the story of constant war and shifting borders. The reconquista was not a straight march south. It was a grinding push and pull. Castles marked the line between one world and another, between Christian and Muslim, between safety and danger. Their towers stood watch over the land, warning of raids and giving refuge when the storms of war rolled in. But what makes Spain's medieval architecture truly remarkable is how these three traditions intertwined. In Toledo, churches were built within former mosques. In Cordoba, the Great Mosque, a forest of arches and light, was later crowned with a Christian cathedral right in its center. This layering wasn't just practical reuse, it was symbolic, almost theatrical. Each new ruler wanted to stamp their faith on the land without entirely erasing what had come before. The result is a palimpsest, a cityscape where history never fully disappears, but instead lingers in arches, domes, and doorways. Jewish architecture, too, added its own voice. Synagogues in Toledo and Cordoba, decorated with stucco patterns reminiscent of Islamic design, show the shared artistic language of the time. These spaces remind us that for centuries, Jews, Muslims, and Christians lived not just in conflict, but also in exchange, borrowing and blending traditions until you could no longer draw clean lines between them. All of this gave Spain a character unlike anywhere else in Europe. While northern lands built stark Gothic cathedrals and fortress keeps, Spain became a land where a single city could hold a mosque, a cathedral, a synagogue, and a castle, sometimes almost side by side. The result is a landscape where every building feels like part of a dialogue, each one answering the last. So when we talk about medieval Spain, don't just think of kings and battles. Think of standing in the shadow of a Burgos spire, or hearing your footsteps echo in the Alhambra's halls, or watching the sunset from the ramparts of a castle. These structures are more than stone. They are memory. They are resilience. and they are the clearest reminder that Spain's medieval story was never simple, but always breathtaking. Step into the dusty plains of 11th century Spain, where kingdoms rose and fell with dizzying speed, and loyalty was often a matter of survival. In this world of shifting alliances, one man's name thundered louder than all others. Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, remembered forever as El Cid. To some, he was a Christian hero who fought to reclaim Spain. To others, he was a mercenary who served whoever paid him best, even Muslim rulers. And yet, through victories, betrayals, and legends woven after his death, El Cid became something greater than a man. He became the very symbol of medieval Spain's spirit. Born around 1043 near Burgos, Rodrigo grew up in a frontier land where Christian and Muslim realms rubbed constantly against one another. He was not a king, not of royal blood, but his talents were undeniable. Sword in hand, he earned his place in the service of Sancho II of Castile, fighting in the brutal wars between Castile, Leon, and Navarre. It was here that Rodrigo's skill as a commander first showed itself. Battles were not just about courage but strategy, and El Cid, though he was not yet called that, proved he had both. When Sancho died and his brother Alfonso VI took the throne, Rodrigo's fortunes changed. Suspicion clouded his relationship with the new king, and eventually he was exiled. For many knights, exile meant ruin. For Rodrigo, it became an opportunity. Cast out from his homeland, he turned his sword toward whoever would hire him. This was the age of mercenary captains, and Rodrigo became the most feared of them all. It was in Muslim-ruled Zaragoza that his legend began to grow. Imagine the shock of Christian knights seeing Rodrigo fighting under the banner of an emir, leading Muslim soldiers into battle against other Christian lords. To his enemies, he was a traitor. To his followers, he was simply doing what a warrior must, surviving, thriving, and seizing glory where he could. From this time came the name El Cid from the Arabic al-Sayyid, meaning the Lord. Even his enemies could not deny his authority. Yet destiny pulled him back into the struggle between Christian and Muslim Spain. By the late 11th century, the reconquista was heating up. Alfonso VI, the same king who had exiled him, needed skilled commanders. El Cid returned, but never as a loyal subject. He was always his own man, carving out his power with both cunning and the sword. His greatest triumph came with Valencia. Through siege and battle, through patient maneuvering and raw determination, El Cid captured the wealthy city in 1094. For 5 years he ruled it as his own principality, blending Christian and Muslim traditions, commanding both with authority. Valencia under El Cid was a rare glimpse of what a mixed Spain could look like, though it was held together by his sheer will. Even after his death in 1099, his widow Jimena defended the city for years, carrying forward his legacy of resilience. The man himself was complex. He fought Muslims but also served them. He defended Christian lands but also raided them when it suited him. He was exiled, celebrated, mistrusted, and adored. That ambiguity is exactly why his legend endured. Later generations, hungry for heroes, polished him into a paragon of Christian knighthood. The epic poem Cantar de Mio Cid, one of Spain's earliest great works of literature, transformed Rodrigo into a flawless knight, chosen by God, loyal to king and country. The reality was grittier, but no less fascinating. What makes El Cid unforgettable is not just his victories, but how he embodied the age itself. Medieval Spain was not a simple clash of Christians versus Muslims. It was a tangled web of alliances, betrayals, and shifting power. El Cid lived that reality. He was both bridge and blade, a man who could ride from the court of a Christian king to the service of a Muslim emir without hesitation. In doing so, he blurred lines that later historians tried to draw sharply. Even today, his shadow lingers across Spain. Statues of El Cid rise in plazas. His name echoes in history books, and the idea of him as both warrior and legend endures. Was he a mercenary, a hero, a conqueror, or a pragmatist? Perhaps he was all of these at once. That is why his story continues to captivate. When you think back to the shock of Tariq ibn Ziyad's invasion, or the stubborn stand at Covadonga, El Cid feels like the fiery middle chapter, the man who carried both the chaos and the promise of medieval Spain in his saddlebag. His sword cut through enemies and myths alike, and what remained was legend. El Cid may have lived in exile, fought under many flags, and ruled as neither king nor emperor, but in the end he became something rarer, the embodiment of a nation's memory. Picture a city of whitewashed houses clinging to the hillsides, towers rising above them, and the snow-capped Sierra Nevada glittering in the distance. This was Granada in the late Middle Ages, a jewel of beauty, but also the last Muslim stronghold in all of Spain. By the 14th and 15th centuries, everything around it had changed. Cordoba had fallen long ago, Seville had been taken, and Toledo had been Christian for centuries. Granada alone remained a fragile kingdom under constant pressure, surviving through cunning politics, tribute, and the brilliance of its culture. Granada's survival was something of a miracle. Founded in the aftermath of Almohad defeat in the early 13th century, it became a refuge for Muslims fleeing the Christian advances. While the rest of Al-Andalus fragmented or collapsed, Granada stood firm. Its rulers, the Nasrid dynasty, built a state that balanced diplomacy and defense with dazzling displays of wealth and artistry. Their crown jewel was the Alhambra, the fortress palace that still overlooks the city today, a place of delicate arches, flowing fountains, and poetry carved into stone. But Granada's survival was never just about walls or palaces. It was about strategy. The Nasrids paid tribute to the crown of Castile, sending gold, silk, and precious goods to their Christian neighbors in exchange for peace. They also played a dangerous balancing act, allying sometimes with Castile, sometimes with North African dynasties, and often switching sides when it suited them. Granada's rulers were masters of diplomacy, knowing that one wrong move could bring their kingdom crashing down. Still, the pressure never eased. Castile and Aragon were growing stronger, especially after their royal marriage united their power. The reconquista was no longer just a slow march south. It had become a clear mission with papal blessing and crusading zeal. Granada, surrounded and isolated, knew its time was running out. Internal struggles only made things worse. Palace intrigues and family rivalries often tore the Nasrids apart, and each civil war weakened the kingdom further. Life inside Granada was a mix of fear and brilliance. On one hand, its people lived under the constant threat of Christian armies pressing closer. On the other, the city blossomed into one of the last great centers of Muslim culture in Europe. Scholars, poets, and architects flourished under Nasrid patronage. The Alhambra itself was filled with verses celebrating paradise on earth, as if the rulers were determined to leave behind eternal beauty even as the walls of their world closed in. And then came the final squeeze. By the late 15th century, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile were determined to finish what centuries of Christian kings had begun. Their combined forces were too powerful for Granada to resist for long. In 1482, a series of wars began that would slowly strangle the kingdom. Christian armies captured towns one by one, cutting off Granada's trade and weakening its defenses. Inside the city, rival factions among the navarres argued over who should rule, sometimes even allying with the Christians in desperate bids for survival. One of the most famous figures of this period was Boabdil, the last king of Granada. Torn between duty, family conflict, and overwhelming odds, he struggled to hold on to what little remained. His reign was marked by both bravery and miscalculation. In the end, no matter how fiercely he resisted, the tide was unstoppable. By 1492, Granada was surrounded, its people starving, its rulers exhausted. The surrender came in January of that year. Boabdil handed over the keys of the city to Ferdinand and Isabella, ending nearly 8 centuries of Muslim presence as a political force in Iberia. Legend says that as he rode away, he turned to look back at his lost city and wept. His mother is said to have scolded him with bitter words, "Do not weep like a woman for what you could not defend like a man." Whether or not the story is true, it captures the heartbreak of that moment. Granada's fall was more than just the end of a kingdom. It was the end of an era, the closing of the chapter begun at Guadalete so many centuries before. With Granada gone, Spain stood united under Christian rule, just as Columbus was preparing to sail west, and Spain was about to step onto the world stage as a global power. Yet, even in defeat, Granada left a mark that never faded. The Alhambra still whispers of its glory. Its poetry, its architecture, its memory live on. A reminder that this last Muslim kingdom, though under crushing pressure, produced some of the most breathtaking achievements of medieval Spain. And in that beauty, the spirit of Granada endures. Picture the scene. It is January 2nd, 1492. A cold morning in the hills overlooking Granada. The last Muslim king of Spain, Boabdil, rides out of the Alhambra palace. Behind him lie the red walls and graceful arches of the last Moorish stronghold in Iberia. Ahead, waiting with banners of Castile and Aragon, stand Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic monarchs. In that moment, nearly 8 centuries of Muslim rule in Spain came to an end. Granada had held out longer than anyone expected. While the caliphate of Cordoba had collapsed centuries earlier, and most of Al-Andalus had been swallowed by Christian kingdoms, Granada endured. Its survival came from cunning politics and geography. Nestled against the Sierra Nevada mountains, it was easy to defend and hard to attack. The Nasrid dynasty, who ruled Granada, paid tribute to Castile when needed, formed alliances when useful, and kept its palaces gleaming as symbols of wealth and sophistication. For more than 200 years, Granada stood as a glittering reminder of the Muslim presence in Spain. But by the late 15th century, the tide had turned. The marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella had united Castile and Aragon, giving them combined strength unlike anything before. Granada was surrounded on all sides. Its trade networks had weakened, and its internal politics grew fragile. When the monarchs decided it was time to finish the reconquista, they committed fully, laying siege after siege, slowly cutting off Granada's lifelines. The campaign was grueling, stretching nearly 10 years. It wasn't one single battle that toppled Granada, but relentless pressure. Fortress towns fell one after another. Christian armies built military camps that looked more like permanent cities, signaling they weren't leaving until Granada surrendered. The Muslim population inside the kingdom grew weary, divided between those who wanted to fight to the last and those who urged negotiation. Boabdil himself was caught between factions and at times even sought help from the Catholic monarchs to outmaneuver rivals within his own family. By the end of 1491, Granada was cornered. Supplies were scarce, morale was crumbling, and resistance seemed hopeless. On January 2, 1492, the gates opened. Boabdil handed over the keys of the city to Ferdinand and Isabella, marking the end of Moorish Spain. Legend says that as Boabdil rode away, he paused at a mountain pass for one final look at his lost city. His mother is said to have told him, "Weep like a woman for the city you could not defend like a man." Whether true or not, the story captures the sorrow of that final departure. The fall of Granada was more than a military victory. It was a turning point in world history. For Spain, it meant unity under Christian rule. For the first time since the Visigoths, Ferdinand and Isabella had achieved what generations of kings had dreamed of. The reconquista was complete. The symbolism was powerful. At the same time that Granada fell, Spain was looking outward. That same year, Columbus set sail west under the monarch's patronage, beginning the age of exploration and empire. Spain's focus shifted from reclaiming its own land to reaching across oceans. But the triumph carried shadows. The surrender terms had promised religious tolerance for Muslims, allowing them to keep their customs, language, and faith. At first, this was honored. Yet within a few years, pressure mounted for conversion. The forced baptisms, the destruction of Arabic manuscripts, and the rise of the Inquisition marked a harsh new reality. The convivencia of Cordoba and Toledo, fragile as it had been, gave way to suspicion and persecution. Many Muslims and Jews chose exile rather than give up their identity. Spain gained unity, but at the cost of losing the rich diversity that had once made it so extraordinary. Still, the memory of Granada endures. The Alhambra, with its poetic inscriptions and shimmering courtyards, stands today as a testament to the brilliance of Moorish art and architecture. Walking through its halls, you can almost feel the weight of that last winter when the fate of a kingdom hung in the balance. So 1492 wasn't just the end of Moorish Spain. It was the dawn of a new world. In 1 year, Granada fell, Columbus set sail, and Spain stepped onto the global stage. From the ashes of Al-Andalus rose a united monarchy ready to shape centuries of history. And yet, in the shadows of the Alhambra, you can still hear the echo of that final surrender. A reminder that every triumph carries with it a story of loss. Close your eyes and think of Spain today. Maybe you picture flamenco dancers in swirling red dresses, a plate of tapas under the Mediterranean sun, or the silhouette of a castle against rolling hills. But beneath every image of modern Spain lies a story that reaches back to its medieval past. The centuries of Moors, kings, castles, and convivencia still shape how Spain sees itself and how the world sees Spain. Start with the land itself. Wander through Andalusia, and you'll find names that whisper of Arabic roots: Guadalquivir, Alhambra, Medina. These aren't just pretty words. They're echoes of the Moorish centuries. Spanish as a language absorbed thousands of Arabic terms from algebra to aceituna, olive. Even the rhythm of flamenco, often thought of as quintessentially Spanish, carries traces of the Moorish scales and the laments of Sephardic Jews. Music, food, and words intertwine, reminding Spaniards that their identity is stitched from many threads. Architecture might be the most visible legacy. Think of the great Mosque of Cordoba, the Alhambra of Granada, or the Giralda Tower in Seville. These masterpieces didn't vanish when Christian kings took over. They were adapted, reshaped, and folded into the fabric of Spanish cities. The Mosque of Cordoba became a cathedral with Gothic arches rising inside a forest of Islamic columns. The Alhambra, built as a Muslim palace, is now one of Spain's proudest symbols. Even Christian cathedrals borrowed Islamic patterns, creating the unique mudéjar style. Walk through Toledo or Segovia today, and you can feel those centuries pressing in from every stone wall. Religion, too, left deep marks. Spain's identity as a Catholic kingdom, forged in the crucible of the Reconquista, still runs strong. The marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella in the 15th century united Castile and Aragon under one Catholic crown, and their drive for religious unity culminated in the expulsion of Jews and Muslims in 1492. That moment reshaped Spain's future, turning it into the champion of Catholicism across Europe and the New World. Even today, festivals, pilgrimages, and holy days remain at the heart of Spanish life, echoing medieval traditions. Yet Spain also carries the quieter memory of the cultures it expelled. The Sephardic Jewish diaspora still calls itself Sepharad, the Hebrew name for Spain, keeping Ladino songs and stories alive. In North Africa, descendants of Muslims expelled from Granada carried Andalusian music and architecture across the sea. These echoes linger in Spanish identity too, like half-forgotten verses of an old song. The medieval legacy is also political. The patchwork of kingdoms, Castile, Aragon, Navarre, Leon, shaped the idea of Spain as a union of diverse regions rather than a single monolithic nation. That medieval fragmentation still resonates today in the push for regional identities like Catalonia and the Basque Country. Just as medieval kings struggled to balance unity with local power, modern Spain wrestles with the same question. How do you weave one nation from so many proud threads? Even Spain's global role connects back to the medieval story. The Reconquista gave Spanish rulers both the confidence and the warrior culture that fueled exploration abroad. The same year Granada fell, Columbus set sail westward, backed by the Catholic monarchs. Spain's empire, with all its triumphs and tragedies, was born directly out of that medieval crucible. When Spaniards look at their history of conquest and colonization, they're looking at an inheritance rooted in the medieval drive for expansion and faith. And then there is the spirit of convivencia, the cultural coexistence of Jews, Christians, and Muslims. Though it was never a perfect harmony, the memory of those centuries lingers as a symbol of what Spain once achieved, a crossroads of civilizations. In literature, in university debates, and in Spain's role as a cultural bridge between Europe and the Arab world, the echoes of convivencia are still heard. Cities like Toledo proudly celebrate that past, reminding the world that Spain was once the meeting place of three great faiths. So when you sip Spanish wine, stroll through the Alhambra's courtyards, or hear the haunting strum of a flamenco guitar, you're not just experiencing modern Spain, you're touching centuries of history layered one atop the other. Medieval Spain never really ended. It flows like an underground river, surfacing again and again in language, art, politics, and identity. And that's the true legacy. A Spain both proudly Catholic and undeniably multicultural, shaped by kings and warriors, but also by poets, philosophers, and dreamers. A Spain that still carries the imprint of Moors, Jews, and Christians in every heartbeat of its culture.